Hey everybody, I hope your week is off to a good start. I'm going to take you through the first section of notes for this new unit that we're going to start on post-World War II and the Cold War. So the section of notes we're going to go through are the post-World War II results of the Allied victory. So you should be able to find the notes as well as the student notes, both in Schoology. And then you'll need to be prepared to answer some questions on an exit ticket once you get through all of these notes. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So the essential questions for this section of notes are, the first one is, what were the consequences of the Allied victory in post-World War II Europe? And then the second question is, how did the results of World War II affect Japan? So because World War II took place in both Europe, and then you had the war in the Pacific that ensued after the war in Europe was over, between Allied forces and the Japanese. We'll be looking at both of those parts separately in the notes today and just talking about how the results of the war affected both of those places. So before we dive into the notes, let's just review a little bit and then make some predictions about what we will be possibly talking about. So a couple of review questions here. Which alliance was victorious in World War II? And then what countries were part of this alliance? If you need to, go ahead and pause this video and answer those two review questions. So the alliance that was victorious in World War II were the Allied powers, and the countries that were part of this alliance were Britain, France, until German occupation from 1940 to 1944, and then the United States once the U.S. joined after the event at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And then if you also mention China as part of this alliance, you are correct. So let's make some predictions about what we're going to talk about in this section of notes. So what do you think conditions will be like in Europe and Japan after World War II is over? So some things to think about here are thinking about the countries that were in the alliance that faced defeat in World War II. So thinking about like Germany and Japan in particular, Italy. Think about the devastation that was caused because of the atomic bombs that were dropped in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Think about what conditions would be like in those two cities. And think about, too, all of those people that were in concentration camps and extermination camps throughout Central Europe that had been liberated or freed from those concentration camps after the war was over. Many of them, were not even in their home countries. Many of them had been separated from their families. So think about some of those things and those kinds of conditions as we get into some of the notes that we're going to look at today. So let's first focus on Europe and what post-World War II looked like in Europe. So after 6 long years in the war, the Allies were victorious. They came out victorious, and their victory, though, would be achieved at a very high price. World War II had caused more death and destruction than any other conflict in history at this point. It had left 60 million total people dead for all of World War II. 40 million of these deaths were in Europe alone, and 2/3 of them were civilians. So not necessarily people that were, fighting in the war, part of the military. These were just, your ordinary, normal people that also faced death. And another 50 million people had been uprooted from their homes and, were displaced. They were wandering the countryside searching for a place to live, because so many places had been damaged because of the war. So, lots of cities had been destroyed, big cities even. And so, because of some of that devastation, you had people that were left without homes. You had people that were searching for their families. And like I mentioned too, those people that were placed in camps um, during the Holocaust, they were not even in their home countries. And so they would be left with nowhere to go, none of their family to turn to, even, which could be devastating. A lot of people didn't stay where they were. A lot of people just tried to go to other places. Some tried to settle back into the norm and just kind of get on with their lives as much as they possibly could. But, they were left without many resources too, because of the destruction that much of Europe had endured during the war, with places being ruined and um, homes being destroyed, buildings being destroyed. So this was a lot that people had to face post-war, and just trying to find, families and a safe place to live was like a big piece of that. In addition to that, you had much of your able-bodied men that were fighting in the military during the war too, which meant that women, just like in World War I, would have to take the jobs of the men working in the factories and dedicating much of the resources that were being fabricated in the factories toward the war effort. And so, because of that, you had a lot of um, agriculture that was disrupted at that point, which then led to things like famine and starvation because not much food was being produced. Um, and so, in addition to that, disease spread through a lot of those cities. People's health was also affected by this too. Um, and so, with that being said, all of this that's going on, um, and we talked about this resulting from World War I too, that when things are going wrong in your country, when you have nowhere to turn to, when you are starting to question a lot of things like, why did this happen? How did we get to this? Um, People will tend to blame the government right away. And, countries like Germany in particular, countries like Italy, especially, who didn't want to go back to the type of government that they had before the war started. They didn't want to go back to um, being led by leaders like Hitler, who was dead at that point, or Benito Mussolini. They didn't want to be led by um, those types of fascist movements um, again. And so there was a lot of questions with people as far as, what kind of government was going to lead them. And again, they were blaming their governments that had been in power before the war even started. And so there were a lot of things that were going on at this point that people were just struggling with. And so lots of devastation that people had faced, just in Europe alone, and especially for those countries that had faced defeat and loss in the war itself, um, would be those ones that would face the most devastation. If we look at the graph here, so this graph shows the cost of World War II for both the alliances that were involved, so the Allied powers and the Axis powers, and the main countries that were part of that. So there's two questions that go along with this, and these two questions are in your notes as well. So the first question asks, which nations suffered the greatest human loss? And the second question is, how does U.S. spending in the war compare to Germany and Japan? So go ahead and pause this video and answer those two questions based on what you see in the graph. So again, question number 1 asks, which nation suffered the greatest human loss according to the chart? So in the chart, you can see that the USSR, so we're looking at this column here, the USSR was one, and then Germany was the other one. So the double crosses here in the chart next to Germany here, this includes about the 170,000 murdered Jews and about 56,000 foreign civilians that were in Germany at the time too. So that's factored into this number. Question number 2 asks, how does U.S. spending in the war compare to Germany and Japan? So if we look at the direct war costs, if you look at the U.S. compared to then the Axis powers, Germany and Japan, you'll notice that the U.S. spent more than Germany and Japan combined in World War II. Now, something to think about, why did the U.S. spend more money on the war than those two countries alone? And the biggest thing with this is that the U.S. spent a lot of money on defense, military. Even before we were involved in the war and we were supplying things to the Allied powers, before we were officially part of the alliance, when the war had started. And then in addition to that, think about the Lend-Lease Act and how much aid we had given to countries in the Allied powers, including China, during the war. So, a lot of that was spent on helping the Allied powers. And then once we were involved in the war, it was spent on defense and military. So that's why we incurred such big costs in World War II. If you want to take a look at this video clip here, it just kind of reiterates the number of deaths in World War II per country, but goes a little bit more in depth with some of the other countries that were involved in World War II. If you want to take a look at that, it's actually a pretty cool video because it shows these bar graphs and it shows the number of deaths represented by coffins. So if you want to take a look at that, it's just a couple minutes long. You can do that. So quick pause and reflect question here. Why was World War II more destructive than any previous war? So if you want to go ahead and pause this video and answer the question, you can do that. So World War II was most definitely more destructive than any previous war in thinking along the lines of technology. New technologies that had been created during World War II were far more extensive than any other war that had been fought previously. I mean, even thinking about World War I, it wasn't until toward the end of World War I when things like airplanes were developed. And so thinking about how much technology had progressed between World War I and the start of World War II, and even thinking about the programs such as the Manhattan Project and how they developed this atomic bomb, nuclear technology, that is a big part of that. And obviously, the destruction that an atomic bomb can cause is a pretty big deal. So that alone can be a big reason why World War II was more destructive than any war before its time. Okay, additionally, in Europe, the Allied nations had to figure out how they were going to deal with war crimes. And all of those leaders that were part of for instance, the Nazi Party, that had basically committed crimes against humanity for murdering approximately 11 million people during World War II. And so they had to deal with this, and they had to face this head on and kind of go through then trials to put these leaders and convict them for what they had done during that time. So from 1945 to 1946, 23 nations put Nazi war criminals on trial in Nuremberg, Germany. And Nuremberg was a city in Germany that hadn't faced much destruction during the war, so they chose to have it there. In the first of the Nuremberg trials, 22 Nazi leaders were charged with waging a war of aggression, and they were also accused of committing crimes against humanity, again, for the murder of 11 million people during that time. So you had leaders, obviously like Adolf Hitler, Schutzstaffel, Chief Heinrich Himmler, and I think he was the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. These two guys were probably the closest leaders to Adolf Hitler. Those three had committed suicide long before the trials began, and so they were never put on trial or charged with anything formally. I mean, I think ultimately they knew what their fate was going to be, and obviously Hitler knew what the fate of Germany was going to be at that point, and so they chose to commit suicide before the war was over and before the trials could even take place. One of the Nazi leaders was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, and then 11 others were basically given a death sentence and were hanged to death. This picture here shows the courtroom of the Nuremberg trials. I think this was when this guy, Hermann Göring, was on trial. And Hermann Göring was the commander of the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe was the German Air Force. And he too would receive a death sentence, but he also kind of cheated the system, cheated the executioner, because he committed suicide the night before he was set to be executed. So again, these guys knew that they knew their fate ultimately. And many of them attested to the fact that they were just following authority. They were following what the authority was telling them to do. If you think about it, if they hadn't done that, what would have happened to them potentially if they weren't following orders and being told or doing what they were told to do and carrying out these crimes? And so, a lot of them, had said that they were just following orders in what they did. So this video is just some additional information from a History Channel video on the Nuremberg trials. If you want to go ahead and take a look at that, feel free. So one other thing that Germany also had to figure out specifically was this was a country that did not want to go back to the type of government that it had had before the war had started, which was the government under the German Empire, the Reich, the German Reich. And so, this was something that they did not want to face. It was almost like they wanted to erase it from their history. And so, they had to basically go through the process of denazification, erasing 12 years of the German Reich under Hitler, getting rid of, the Nazi insignia, the swastikas, taking down flags, all of those emblems and things that had been put on buildings that for the time were permanent. They had to be taken off or erased somehow. And so that would in turn take some rebuilding as well to get rid of all of that. And, Germans had to adjust to this post-Nazi life. Again, many questions as far as, what type of government would they turn to at this point? And, how are they going to handle this? And we'll talk a little bit more about what's going to happen to Germany in particular after the war is over and kind of leading up into the Cold War in this unit specifically. Also, what they came out with were some laws, and Mrs. Melms had mentioned this in the Holocaust notes about, how some of the laws in Germany revolving around like the Holocaust, how they are not supposed to deny that the Holocaust happened. And this video here actually highlights a lot of those laws, so we'll just go ahead and watch this.
The copyright on Adolf Hitler's autobiographical manifesto, Mein Kampf, expires at the end of this year, and Munich's Institute of Contemporary History is making plans to republish the text for the first time in Germany since 1945. The reason for this long lapse in publication is that Germany has spent the last 70 years attempting to distance itself from the disgraced Nazi regime. It has done this by instituting a number of laws and public policies heavily restricting references to Nazi symbolism and propaganda. So what are Germany's anti-Nazi laws? Well, in the years following the fall of the Nazis, American occupying forces confiscated all media in Germany that supported the Nazi Party. They also destroyed all German military and Nazi memorials, with the exception of tombstones, along with any related artwork. Since wiping the slate clean, the German government included a list of directives banning all Nazi-era symbols. The laws restrict the creation, dissemination, storage, and importation of any unconstitutional political party's media, particularly the Nazi Party. It also bans any flags, insignia, uniforms, slogans, and forms of greeting associated with those parties. However, the law makes a distinction in the context of art, science, research, education, and journalism. And although there is not an exhaustive ban list, it is generally considered to include in one form or another swastikas, the Celtic cross, the solar cross, the SS emblem, the Odal rune, Wolf's Angel, the Nazi war flag, the greeting Sieg Heil, Heil Hitler, singing the national anthem, or saying the Nazis' motto. It is also illegal to deny the Holocaust, and this could lead to imprisonment. Despite the understandable strictness of this ban, there have been some unintended consequences. In 2006, the use of anti-fascist symbols which featured a crossed-out swastika were deemed illegal, as violations of the ban, despite their obviously opposite purpose. In order to paint the absurdity of this interpretation, a member of the legislative branch turned herself in to the German police for having displayed the crossed-out swastika during an anti-neo-Nazi rally. In 2007, the German government clarified that this particular symbol was clearly not pro-Nazi propaganda and would be exempt. Even though these anti-Nazi laws exist, the German government has only banned 2 political parties in its history, despite the resurgence of a neo-Nazi political party in German parliament. As a democratic nation, Germany has long been struggling to prevent its history from reoccurring, while attempting to allow for freedom of speech. The republication of this heavily annotated version of Mein Kampf is a clear example of Germany's balancing act between the importance of historical documentation and the explicit disapproval of their shameful past. Even with Germany's ban on Nazi propaganda, Nazism is on the rise in Europe. Check out a video to learn more.
Okay, so as you can see, it was a process that they had to go through in order to just kind of erase everything that had been kind of left behind as far as the Nazi Party was concerned, and getting rid of all of that. And that would take some time too. And like I said, we'll talk about kind of the future of Germany later on in this unit. So shifting gears here, let's talk a little bit about what post-war Japan was like. So again, keeping in mind that Japan's devastation mostly is resulting from the atomic bombs that were dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and just the aftermath and the effects of that alone were devastating. And in addition to that, too, Japan also faced defeat in World War II as well. So, not only was the country left in ruins, but, they had also lost the war. So 2 million lives were lost from Japan in World War II, and the country's major cities also faced destruction, including their capital, Tokyo, which had been destroyed by bombing raids that took place during World War II. And then, like I mentioned, the 2 cities that were basically nuclear wastelands as a result of the atomic bombs being dropped by the United States, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had basically been laid to waste. I mean, they were completely destroyed, basically, because of the atomic bombs. And in addition to that, the Allied powers um, had stripped Japan of its colonial empire after the war was over. So remember, Japan was one of the aggressors that we talked about leading up to World War II, one of the aggressive nations that was taking land and territory in Asia. And countries like Britain um, and the US were just appeasing Japan, just like they had done to Germany, because you didn't want another war to start. And so they were creating this colonial empire, this Japanese empire. And at this point, after the war was over, the Allied powers were taking away bits and pieces of its empire. I mentioned the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So here's an aerial view of Hiroshima a year after the atomic bomb was dropped. And it shows a little bit of reconstruction. However, it would take years after the devastation of the atomic bombs for these Japanese cities to recover and rebuild in the aftermath of that. And a reason for that was because Japan had faced many shortages with materials and things that were needed to rebuild. And so they would do this at a much slower pace. So, like I said, it would take them years to be able to do so. So, in the meantime, the U.S. will then occupy Japan, and U.S. General Douglas MacArthur will basically be in charge of that. And so, MacArthur wanted to be as fair as possible, but also did not want to start any other conflicts with Japan. In thinking about how they were going to handle this with them. And so basically, what they would start doing is the process of demilitarization. And so, what this basically means is that they would demilitarize or disband the Japanese armed forces and military. And this was actually achieved pretty quickly. And when all was said and done, Japan was left with just a small police force. And this kind of sounds a little bit familiar too, because even after World War I, this happened to Germany. Germany's military was forcibly shrunk by the Allied powers as well. Also, just like in Germany, many of the Japanese war criminals were put on trial for crimes against humanity and for waging war. And so 7 of these, and they were mostly military leaders of Japan, would receive death sentences. There were 25 of them total that were put on trial. So 7 of them received death sentences, and then the rest, for the most part, would basically get life sentences in prison. Also, the US would begin the process of democratization in Japan as well. And basically, what this means is it was trying to create a government in Japan that would be elected by the people. So, what they did was they changed the Japanese government over to a constitutional monarchy, and the US would help Japan draw up a new constitution. So it would change it from an empire under an emperor to now a constitutional monarchy, kind of like what Great Britain has. So the position of the emperor would change just a little bit, where the emperor wouldn't necessarily have the power that he had had previously. And so the emperor would still be there. However, the emperor would just be like a figurehead or a symbol of Japan at this point. Additionally, there was the creation of the prime minister's position, which would be chosen by a majority of the Diet, which was the parliament, the two-house parliament of Japan. And the parliament members would be elected by the people. So there's the democracy part of democratizing Japan, is that the people would get to elect their members of their legislative body, which is the parliament, the Diet. They also came up with a Bill of Rights in their constitution, which basically gave them basic freedoms that they would be able to have. So, the U.S. was trying to help Japan create some stability in their government while also trying to prevent another war from starting or another conflict from starting with Japan as well. And for the most part, this was very successful. And in fact, the Japanese would be very accepting of this for the most part. And ironically, Japan and the U.S. are basically allies even today. So, thinking about how that has progressed since what we talked about in World War I, where Japan and the U.S. were allies in World War I, then that would change in World War II, and now it would flip back to the U.S. and Japan are allies once again, and they have a pretty strong relationship even at this point too. So the U.S. would spend and put a lot of effort into trying to help Japan post-war. Here's a video if you want to take a look at this that explains the Japanese monarchy in addition to the prime minister's position and the parliament and all of that. So if you want to look at that, you can. So just a quick opinion question on post-war Japan specifically. Do you think that the U.S. should have occupied Japan post-war and kind of helped them out with those programs of with demilitarization and democratization? And why or why not? So I'm going to take a couple of minutes and go ahead and answer that question. Again, this is just an opinion question, and backing that up with some evidence. Go ahead and do that. Just a couple of other things here. These two websites here are really cool because this one in particular does show some of the before and after images. I'll just click on one really quick. So you could see the before and after pictures of after the atomic bombs were dropped and then what they look like now. So I guess it's kind of a then and now of what things look like. So yeah, some of these are pretty interesting to see. So if you want to go ahead and take a look through that, feel free to do so. All right, and then the last thing is to go ahead and answer the summary of the essential question. So we talked about the two essential questions at the beginning of this section of notes. So go ahead and fill in the summary questions at the very end of your notes now. So the consequences of the Allied victory in post-World War II Europe were, so that one focuses just on Europe, and then the results of World War II affected Japan by, and then here you can talk about Japan and, specifically U.S. occupation of Japan and how that kind of helped them out. So if you guys have any questions on this section of notes, please feel free to reach out to myself, Mrs. Mayer, or Mrs. Melms. And then once you finish this section of notes up, make sure that you go into Schoology and fill out the exit ticket with just a few questions, kind of a check for understanding from this section of notes. So, all right, hope you guys are having a good day. Have a good rest of the week, and we'll talk to you soon.